Hey guys, Matthew and welcome to another video. Today we're going to be talking about the development manifesto for harvest crafting, which all hit us like an absolute truck today. Now I normally don't do this, but the reason why I'm making this video is because I really think this needs to get a lot of attention, like lots and lots and lots of attention. So share this video with whoever you want, your mom, your dad, anybody who works at GGG. They need to see this because they are about to make a massive mistake if they go through with this. I think Reddit has been very vocal about it, Twitter as well, but I want to play my part as well. So before I start though, I do want to say something. I'm not going to be looking at this with the perspective of somebody who is a 0.1%er, and I'm also not going to be looking at this from the perspective of somebody who is a completely new player or a giga casual. Reason for that is that these changes do not really affect either of those extremes on the spectrum. What these changes really do affect and who is you guys, the over average viewer, the player, the people who get to red maps, who get to the end game, who do the end game content, who make a decent amount of currency, who are not 0.1%ers who can sit there spamming hundreds of thousands of fossils because they play 12 hours a day, but also people who can actually afford pretty decent items overall. These are the people who are getting completely annihilated from these changes. So first off, let's go ahead and talk about the changes themselves. Now there's basically two massive changes, and I think that either of them by themselves would be kind of okay, but put together makes a recipes for disaster where, in my opinion, harvest is basically rendered completely useless. So the first one is that some mods that had overly deterministic behaviors have been removed. This include all annulment mods. So anything that is remove or remove add is gone. That's pretty rough, but by itself, I could actually see this being somewhat viable as a way to balance it. The thing is, the next line completely takes this line and makes it 20 times worse than it is because of the compounding nerfing, I guess. So crafts that adds mods of specific types, like physical modifiers, for example, to items can now only be applied to non-influence item. Put these two together and harvest is dead. Quite frankly, there's going to be some niche scenarios where it's actually worthwhile using, but for the most part, it is dead. Now, let's talk about the actual manifesto, and then I'll go through the reasoning why I think this is horrible for the game. So, under Path of Exil's item philosophy, there's a couple things I want to cover. First off, it says it's also important that items are hard to perfect. Ideally, there's significant diminishing returns in the currency items crafting process, which lets most players just get something good enough relatively easy, and the experts players can show off with their really good items that took a lot of effort to make. Okay, I agree with that. What basically they're saying is that the cost related to the initial 80 or 90% power spike of an item should be a lot less than the cost related to the final 10% power increase of an item. I think that makes sense. A perfect item should be significantly harder to make and significantly more expensive than a somewhat good item. But the thing is, it already is, even with harvest, something I'll talk about in a second. Now, the next thing, which I think was completely delusional and really comes to showcase how disconnected the game devs are from the community and from the state of the Path of Exile game right now, is this. We don't want to take away the feeling of closing your eyes and exalting an item scared to see whether you ruined it or not. Well, the reality is nobody has that feeling because nobody closes their eyes to exalt their items to see if they ruin it or not. Nobody takes that risk. If they want a better item, they're going to farm the currency and buy it. If it doesn't exist, they're going to wait until it exists. Nobody goes there, closes their eyes, and slams an exalts on an item hoping to get lucky. People haven't done that since metacrafting has been much less relevant, and that's been a very long time, pretty much ever since fossils have been introduced to the game. So we're talking years since people had to do this, where they would alt spam a single mod, regal another one, and then when they got really lucky, they would exalt for a third mod, and then if they got really lucky, they could go under the meta crafting process if they had thousands of exalts ready to just completely throw away, in most cases without ever finishing their items. Nobody wants to go back to the Stone Age. Nobody wants to go back to that method of crafting either. Now that we've covered this, let's talk about some actual statistics, some actual numbers, and my arguments. So I want to showcase the fact that they say that important items should be hard to perfect. And while I do agree with this, I don't think that Harvest made them necessarily too easy. Okay, so here what we have is the odds of Exalt slamming with both open prefixes and suffixes, merciless, which is T1% physical damage on a foil. 6,372 Exalts. Now, this is not at all the best way to do this. There's definitely some ways that we can improve our odds here. So what I'll do next, because this number is very scary even to me, is I'm going to look at what's the odds of Exalt slamming merciless if I'm a little bit smarter about it, and I slam an Exalt that is physical. So I slam a physical mod with Harvest with both my prefixes and suffixes opened, 832 Exalts. But I can do better. I can actually be a little bit smarter about this, and I can slam a physical prefix, which is basically locking my suffixes on a non-influence foil, and the odds of getting the same merciless is still 692. How many people can afford 692 physical augment slams or remove adds in order to get one mod on their item? Quite frankly, nobody outside of the 0.1%. Now, it doesn't mean that it's going to take 692 tries, but it doesn't mean that it won't take 3,000 tries either. There is some RNG involved. These are just averages. But we are talking about 692 physical damage remove adds with only open prefixes, which is your best case scenario in order to get this mod. Now, to be fair, this is one of the hardest mod in the game to get, so it's a bit of an extreme example. But who in their right mind would consider this too easy to acquire? I really think that on this case here, where they're saying perfect items are too easy and they should be harder, they're a little bit disconnected from reality when looking at the odds of even getting some specific mods. And that goes for pretty much all of the GG mods. You could look at the same thing for +1 all caster on a wand, or tailwind on boots, etc, etc. There's a lot of these mods which are very, very difficult to get. Of course, there are certain deterministic mods which are very easy to get, but on most items, you're always going to have at least 1 or 2 mods which are going to cost you a significant amount of currency if you want to end up with a perfect item. This also is typically going to be made in tandem with beast crafting and imprint dupe bases, which that alone can cost you tons and tons and tons of exalts just to get the dupe, the base that you need to exist. So, is it really too easy? I'm gonna go ahead and say no. Now that I've talked about this though, I want to talk about the actual issues, in my opinion, with Harvest changes. Now, I really do think that Harvest brings deterministic crafting, and I really do think that it brings perfect, or somewhat close to perfect items much easier, but I don't think those items are too easy because the vast majority of players would never even get them. The 0.1% would get them anyways, and the pure casuals would never get them anyways. So realistically, why does it matter if it's easier when it's not easy at all? All right, now let's talk about it. So the first issue with it is that build diversity goes out the window. Now, this is not completely true, but it is true that if you're looking to play a non-meta build, right, that nobody's playing, your own little niche thing, and you want to get to the end game, having a Harvest available to you and being able to make perfect items for your specific build is going to make pretty much any build way more viable. So what we're going to look at here is basically the week 6 snapshot of PoE Ninja and Ritual League, and we will see that there's actually quite a few different ascendancies that are being played, and to reach 50%, we need to look at like the first 5 or 6 different ascendancies that people are playing, and that is a very, very good diversity in terms of builds that are being played here. Even if we look at the main skill builds, it does look like there's a significant portion of people playing Blade Vortex and Cyclone, for example. But the thing is, Cyclone and Blade Vortex both have multiple different types of Cyclone and Blade Vortex players. So for example, for Blade Vortex, we have Cold, Fire, Self-Curse, MOM type of Blade Vortex. There's many different ways to play it. And for Cyclone, of course, we have melee, but we also have cast on crit. So this is a little bit misleading in the percentages. On the other hand, if we look at a league that did not have deterministic crafting, like Heist, for example, we only need to take the first 3 ascendancies to make for the 50% of players. So the majority of players, over 50%, are basically playing 3 different ascendancies versus a league with the ability to use Harvest. We actually almost are doubling the amount of different builds that people are playing. And if we pay attention here, we'll see that 18% of people were playing Charon Golems, 10% BV. Now, there weren't that many different versions of BV available because, of course, without Harvest crafting, it's pretty much just going to be Spellcaster BV for the most part. Spellcaster like Assassin BV. And then the rest of it is basically very little in terms of the amount of people playing. So we do know for a fact that Harvest is allowing more build diversity. Also, this is not 100% accurate because it only takes the top like 10 or 15% of the ladder, and a lot of people later in the league are, re-rolling multiple different characters which are never going to hit level 100, therefore they're never even going to appear on the ladder. So because of that, it's a little bit misleading. But still, there's a lot more different builds being played when Harvest is around because people are able to play these non-meta skills instead of going for the flavor of the month build and everybody being stuck playing 3 different builds, and that's it. All right, now we need to talk about the second point, and that is the 99% who aren't making tons of currency, right? The non-1% players are never going to be able to afford perfect items. So here's the thing. I'm just going to give you guys an example here, and we're going to look at different variations of a minion helmet. Now, we'd have the ultimate budget minion helmet, which would have only like +3 minion and then minion damage. That would be 25C. Right? This would probably be somewhat similar even without Harvest because these are not too hard to make at all. Right, next, if we go a step further, we would have double influence where we'd have hyperthermia, spell crit +3, and our minion damage. This essentially, what we'd be doing here is we would be awakener orbing the +3, or sorry, we would be spamming fossils for the +3 and the minion damage, and then we would probably have to do some reforges or some meta crafting for the hypothermia and the spell crit. A helmet like this right now is somewhere in the ballpark of 12 exalts for the cheapest ones. If we did not have Harvest as an option for crafting, this helmet would be probably 50, 60, 70, 100 exalts, right? Easily 100 exalts. Now, if we go a step further and we also introduce the socketed deal more elemental damage, which is an essence modifier, we will see that these helmets are 40, 50 exalts. You remove Harvest from the game, this is now a mirror tier helmet. There's only going to be a couple of these that will exist during the duration of the league, and if we're looking at only T1 stats, it's probably just going to be 1 and only 1. There's almost no chance that there's going to be multiple of these perfect ones existing outside of Harvest. Okay, but now if we look at a step further and we go with elevated on an item, right, even a single, there's only 12 of them, and that is with Harvest available. Now, what happens if we remove Harvest? Well, quite frankly, probably we won't ever see these again, which means the fact that they're removing Harvest from now on means that any of these helmets that will be hitting standard will be the best in the game for as long as until they basically add another sort of deterministic crafting which allows us to beat these helmets. Now, I'm not a standard player, but I still do think we need to take into consideration the standard economy at least a little bit, and the fact that people are never going to be able to acquire these helmets anymore makes it very I guess unfair for the greater good of diversity in the mirror market, or people offering mirror services. Now, we can go even a step further and look at triple elevated mods alongside the essence modifier, and these would never ever exist if it wasn't for Harvest, and that could be okay because realistically they're extremely strong. But now, because of Harvest, we are seeing multiple of these actually existing, which brings me to my next point. the monopoly of GG gear to a single or very few players. If you somehow were able to make a helmet like this in a league where Harvest is not available, you would be the only person who has access to this, which means not only do you get to choose your mirror fee price, and you're the only person in the game or in the league with that item, therefore the price is whatever you decide it is. Not only that, there's a pure monopoly, and anybody who wants to mirror an item, a perfect helmet, has to go to you. Now that's good if that is you, but that's not good for the economy, because after 3, 4, 5 mirror services, let's say your mirror fee is 100x, that's an extra 400, 500 exalt in your pockets, which you can then use to make more mirror tier items because you can afford it and nobody else can, and therefore you can snowball to the point where there's basically just a few, or even sometimes just a couple players with many different mirror tier items, and everybody else basically can't compete because they're getting fed mirror fee services, or the fees from the mirror services, and that's allowing them to craft way more than literally any other player. And that again creates a monopoly, which is very bad for the game. Now, the reason why these two things are bad is that if it's only the top 1% who are able to afford some of this higher end gear, the people who are not part of the 1%, right, the crazy rich, the people who are the more average or even higher than average player, are basically left with two solutions. Either they farm the currency in order to mirror that specific item and pay the fee, or, in my opinion, it encourages RMT. Now, the reason for that is because people want to copy the best builds. They'll go on PoE Ninja, they'll go to their favorite content creator, whatever it is, and they'll want to copy the build 1-to-1. Sometimes because they don't know that you can have it a little bit worse, but sometimes also because they won't know how to make it. Without Harvest, knowing how to make it goes out the window, because it's not about that, it's about just getting lucky. So that, in my opinion, at least, encourages RMT, and I think that's really bad for the game because that encourages more bots, that encourages, obviously, higher inflation of different currencies. Overall, it's just a bad time. And, of course, we don't like monopolies of people, or a very select few people, or a select group of people having all the mirror tier items and being able to just basically keep their snowball going, and everybody gets left behind. I think that's pretty awful. Now, another reason why I don't think this is a good change is because the true endgame for solo self-found players basically becomes limited to very few builds, if any builds at all. Now, if we look at solo self-found hardcore and we look at week 4 of Ritual, I will see that there is some diversity in the builds. Now, the thing is, if we looked at, for example, the week 4 of solo self-found heist, we would also be seeing a fair bit of diversity. The reason for that is that there are very few amount of people who are actually hitting the top of the ladders due to the fact that people die in hardcore, right? So you are seeing a lot of build diversity because the people who actually get to the end game, or to level 100 anyways, are the only people who are showing up on the ladder. And if you ever die, your entire character gets reset. So even if you're playing something niche, so long as you stay alive, you will end up on the ladder. But for content creators, and for streamers, and for video makers, removing endgame is really bad. It's really bad for solo self-found content creators because they are forced on more boring builds. They can't do some of the higher end content because their builds, only a few different builds can even do it. And now if you remove Harvest, even those builds are going to struggle doing it. So is there going to be even less builds that can actually even do it, period? It just becomes very boring, at least in my opinion, watching literally every solo self-found hardcore player playing the exact same build because it's the only build that's capable of doing the end game content, and every other build stands no chance. Harvest allows, as I mentioned previously in the video, people to make good gear that can make bad builds work good. The same way a headhunter allows any bad build to become somewhat viable just because it's a headhunter. Right. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is basically player retention. The fact that without Harvest and, deterministic crafting and all that, people lose sight of goals, right? It's much easier if somebody comes to my stream and asks me how to craft an item and I tell them exactly how to craft it deterministically, and then they can come up with a cost of what they expect this to cost, and then they can be like, okay, so if I farm 50 Exalt, the chances of me being able to craft this deterministically is pretty high. I'm going to go ahead and farm the Exalt. It's going to be a good time. Then I'm going to get my item. Maybe I'm lucky it costs a bit more. Maybe I'm unlucky it costs a bit less, but still I'm giving a good ballpark. Meanwhile, for example, if you look at let's just look at a belt, for example, here. What's the odds of getting a belt with T1 life and triple T1 resistance without harvest? 6,268 3-socket resonators. That is more currency than most people will see in their entire life, right? Not viable at all. With harvest, I would tell somebody, okay, so you alt spam for T1 life, or you use pristine fossils, and then you can deterministically get the cold res, the fire res, and the lightning res to T1 within, cold, fire, and lightning rerolls respectively, and it's going to be like a 1 in 1 in 7 or 1 in 8 or whatever for each of them. If they're costing you 1 or 2x, you can deterministically make the perfect belt for your build within about a, let's say, 30 or 40 or 50x budget. That's a lot better than if I tell them, yeah, well, 6,268 3-socket resonators. Good luck, dude. You know, nobody wants that. So if you see this, this is very discouraging. If I tell you that you have to, farm 20, 30, 40x in order to make it happen, you're a lot more likely to view this as a realistic goal, and therefore to go out and play the game more. Now, more people playing the game and means, better player retention. And what that means is that people play more builds, right? And their builds are better, so they're more likely to invest money in their build. Now, this is funny to me. It's actually really funny to me because even from a business perspective, this decision of removing harvest makes no sense, because it means less people playing different builds every single league and less people enjoying bad builds, and therefore nobody buying MTX for those builds. Meanwhile, harvest makes bad builds work, therefore people buy MTX for those bad builds. I don't understand it, again, even from a business perspective. But what I meant though, from the no goals to reach anymore and player retention. So if we look at the Steam charts, now of course this is only numbers from Steam, but from what we know from GGG, about 50% people play from Steam, 50% play from the standalone client. So it's somewhat okay to go off of these numbers. If we look at the player retention this league after the first month of the league, or even the second month, it is better than literally ever before. It's not even close. There has never been as good of a player retention as there has been this league. The reason for that is very simple. Well, of course, we have Echoes of the Atlas, which is really, really good because of the whole Atlas skill tree and all that. But that's not it. People are able to actually set goals for themselves and then, come up with numbers that are realistic in order to achieve their goals, and therefore they're much more likely to go through with them, play the game, make the currency, and make it happen. And that basically keeps people playing more different builds, keeps people playing these weird off-meta, unique builds that they actually really enjoy, and therefore buying more MTX, which goes right back to what I was saying about the business aspect of it. And I've already talked about it, but basically crafting isn't really fun anymore. It's just gambling. That's the example I gave about, 6,268 fossils. And you don't really have any alternative if there wasn't harvest that would allow you to remove every mod individually. And even if it's multiple exalts for every single mod, which for a lot of people is considered a lot of currency, at least you can kind of somewhat make it achievable, so long as you're willing to go through and farm the currency. And the last reason why I really don't understand this change is Maven orbs. These were just introduced, and the way Maven orbs work is they strip an item from one influence mod and then they elevate another one. But without harvests, why would you ever use a Maven's orb? I honestly don't understand. They just introduced a new boss, a new endgame boss, a new endgame mechanic with the 10 invitations and all that good stuff in order to fight the endgame boss after doing the invitations and whatnot, getting the Maven's Writ, in order to go fight a boss which drops basically a bunch of 1 chaos items, right? Pretty much just all garbage items. and then a Maven's Orb, which is the rarest drop and the best drop, except the Maven's Orb is literally just a targeted annul, which has a 50-50 chance of bricking your item, and that's it. Because, of course, let's say you elevate an exploded chest, which, by the way, you can't get deterministically anymore, which means you have to go through thousands of alterations. Then you Maven Orbit alongside another influence mod, and there's a 50-50 chance that you have to re-alt spam those 2,000 alterations in order to get your explode mod back. Nobody at all wants to go with something through something like this. It's just not fun. And I don't understand, again, why GGG is basically pushing the games in a backward direction. We're literally not going forwards, we are going backwards in terms of crafting. And that's pretty much all I have for you guys. Like I said earlier, I'm really hoping that GGG kind of comes back on this decision. I mean, it's not a good business decision. It literally encourages people to RMT. It creates a bigger rift between the rich players and the poor players. The rich players are richer and the poor players are poor, because obviously there's no middle ground anymore. Like I was explaining with these helmets here, you know, the middle ground won't exist anymore. There's going to be only the very entry level stuff, right? And if you can't afford to mirror the next best thing, there is no next best thing, which means I mean, there's no middle ground. So you've got two choices. Either you farm the currency for just a mirror and you mirror the item that you want with the fee, or you just stick with your garbage items. And I think now that people have tasted harvest crafting and, you know, being able to get the end game gear without having to play the game literally 12 hours a day, it gives a much, you know, I don't think this is a good change, I guess is what I'm trying to say, as I have been for the past 20 plus minutes. So I think it's about time I call it. Before I go though, I want to say a huge thank you to my supporters. Jordan, Lost with the Map, Krem is so nice, Flame Scorpion, Nathaniel, Richard, JW Players, Scott, Young B, Tuck Tuck, Michael, Ashley, Pablom's Cool, Keebs, Marcus, Justin, Matt, Kevin, Powell, Mercury, Ethan, Citri, Jared, Axel, and Acid, as well as huge thank you to Phenom and Trevor. Hopefully you guys enjoy the video. And I really hope they go, you know, and they go back on this change and they don't go through with this. But here's to hoping, boys, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.